Can the moon be considered sacred? Who decides if it is sacred or not? Are there ways to bring marginalized voices in conversations about how we settle the moon? What is the overview effect, and can it have a positive impact on how we think about humanity? We join Professor Deana Weibel in a wide ranging conversation about these topics and more on this episode of Chai on the Moon. Hello, and welcome to Chai on the Moon, where we talk about societal and ethical issues related to human settlements in space, and in particular on the moon. Our guest today is Professor Deana Weibel, and I'm really fascinated by her work. I have told her off camera as well, and I'm saying that on camera, but it's really fascinating. I will list a bunch of her papers in the description of this video, so please, you can actually go out and check out more. Professor Weibel is a cultural anthropologist. She is in the anthropology and religious studies program at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. Her work primarily focuses on religion, especially on topics of pilgrimage, sacred space, the mutual influence of scientific and religious ideas on each other, and religion and space exploration. And this is the part that we will be talking about today. Her fieldwork has been on pilgrimage sites in France and in New Mexico, which I am biased to because I love New Mexico.
Me too.
Her recent work focuses on religion as a motivation for and influence on space travel and other space based sciences, with field visits taking place at space sites throughout the US, including the Johnson and Kennedy Space Center, the Mojave Air and Spaceport, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, and New Mexico's Spaceport America. Professor Weibel actually spent a month. This is something that caught my attention in her intro at the Vatican Observatory studying the Pope's astronomer. I don't think we're going to get to that part this time, but maybe at another one.
Okay.
She's also the co founder and co organizer of Roger That, a celebration of space exploration in honor of Roger B. Chaffee, a 2-day conference that has been an annual Grand Rapids, Michigan event since 2017. Professor Weibel, welcome.
Thank you so much.
So let's jump directly into it, and let's start about a mission that happened this early this year. And this was by Astrobotics technology, which was taking a spacecraft to the moon. And it didn't make it ultimately. It failed and it burnt up in our Earth's atmosphere. But there was some controversy about it, and you actually wrote about it as well. And just as a reminder, your paper is going to be linked in the description of this video. But tell us a little bit about what the controversy was.
Sure. The controversy was that there were human remains that were included on the payload of the lunar lander that Astrobotics sent. So there were two parts to the mission. They had one section of the craft that continued past the moon, but the part with the lander was supposed to go into lunar orbit and eventually land. And there's a company called Celestis. Now, I did field work with Celestis. It was one of the missions where they were planning to send human remains into space as a memorial. And the one that I went to was ultimately scrubbed and rescheduled. And the people whose remains were on board ended up having their remains put on future flights. In fact, I think the ones that we're talking about now. But Celestis is a company that does space memorials. So for a certain fee, you can have the cremated ashes of a loved one, a friend, in some cases a pet, um, put into a small container. It's kind of like depends on the size, like a watch battery up to a larger one, anywhere between 1 and 8 ounces. And they have a full event for the family members to come to. So I was at Spaceport America and in Los Alamos, not Los Alamos. it'll come to me later. But anyway, near Spaceport America, Las
Yeah.
Cruces. There we go.
Las Cruces, yes.
I just had Los Alamos on my mind, and um, there was a memorial with an astronaut giving part of the memorial, a bagpipe player playing Amazing Grace, families talking about their loved ones. And this was all in preparation for a sounding rocket that was going to be launched from Spaceport America. And this particular mission was a low Earth orbit mission where, no, I'm sorry, let me reverse that. It was a suborbital mission. They do low Earth orbit sometimes, and they do other kinds, but the suborbital one was what I was going to watch, with the capsules going into space, coming back down, and being retrieved. The one that was part of the Astrobotics mission had two parts. The lunar one was going to bring these capsules, which included human remains for more than 100 people, um, onto the surface of the moon as part of the planned soft landing of the lander. And another portion was going to go into deep space and just basically never return. And the cremated remains in both portions included those of Gene Roddenberry, his wife Majel Barrett, and several actors and actresses from the Star Trek series. They also, Celestis will also send up DNA. I think it's a cheek swab that they do, something like that. And Gene Roddenberry's son, Rod Roddenberry, his DNA was going up along with his parents. So the controversy was that the Navajo Nation, which is sort of the political body of the Diné people, the current president was not, there was a problem associated with it. Back in the 90s, Eugene Shoemaker's, part of his cremated remains were sent.
Astronomer.
Right, astronomer, yeah. And he was a geologist, Eugene Shoemaker. He was very active training Apollo astronauts, and he wanted to go to the moon. He never went to the moon himself. He died at a relatively young age. And so, as kind of a thank you, the plan was to take some of his cremated remains and put them on the surface of the moon. And when this happened, the Navajo Nation was very upset because the moon is considered a sacred body, a sacred place in their religion. And there is a strong sense in the community that dead bodies, cremated or not, are something that is a polluting force. And so for somebody's remains to be intentionally left on the moon was seen as a violation of their religious beliefs, or something that was causing problems in the community, as a taboo had basically been broken, or just it was considered not respectful. And so what had happened was that NASA had sort of agreed with the Navajo Nation that they would consult before they did a similar mission. Astrobotics, however, is a private company that was using some of their payload for NASA, but also some of their payload for companies like Celestis. And there was at least one other kind of memorial space thing that they did. And NASA didn't see this as something that it was a decision they were making. And so when it came out that this is what was going to happen, the president of the Navajo Nation was upset because he felt like this was a violation of an agreement that had been made. And essentially, the president of Celestis said, this isn't polluting, this isn't a violation. NASA said this isn't our mission. And so really nothing was done to prevent it from happening. I will say, having been on the other side, I understand that the people who were sending cremated remains were taking this very seriously as a form of a memorial. But ultimately, there was a fuel leak, and the lander was not able to make it to the moon and ended up burning up in orbit as it was coming down through the atmosphere. So it left the question kind of unresolved, although Charles Schaefer, who's the president of Celestis, did say that they always take more cremated remains than they need. So there could be a future mission where they would once again place these folks on the moon because that was what it is. And it's interesting to talk to people who work for Celestis and people who are, using their services, because there's a very strong tendency to refer to the cremated remains as passengers and to give them almost personhood, where they're talked about like, this is the experience he always wanted, this is finally fulfilling, our son's dreams, or our daughter always wanted to go into space and now she is. And so as an anthropologist who studies a number of different religious things, including mortuary rituals, the way that personhood gets attached to these cremated remains is fascinating. But it's also fascinating to see how the moon itself, as a sacred place, can have so many different definitions and understandings, and is really what we call in the anthropology of pilgrimage a contested space.
Yeah. So this is really, by the way, we are having this conversation in February of 2024, and the person at issue, considering recent court rulings in terms of IVF and the embryos for personhood.
Oh,
So I mean,
yeah.
this is actually an interesting context on the other side. And if you do that, what does that do? So I'm just from a uh, technical perspective, a practical perspective, when they take those remains, or do they on the moon, for example, are they expected to just leave them in a capsule, or are they spread out, or how does that practically happen? What
I,
is expected to happen?
what was meant to happen is that it would have a soft landing, and then you know, there was no way to remove the ashes from the
Okay.
capsules. So they would just sort of stay there as, you know, any other kind of payload. I think some of the NASA payloads that get sent up have electronic components to them, and they do different things or take pictures or, have experimental qualities. But these are mostly just kind of inert metal containers that have ashes of human people in them. But some of the misinformation was interesting because I was reading people thinking like entire bodies were going
Right.
up or large portions of cremated remains. And the term that gets used in the companies that do this is a symbolic portion of cremated remains. So
Okay.
the symbolism is like everywhere. That's the main thing
Right.
that's going on.
And I remember, so by the way, that's where my New Mexico connection comes in. I actually went to New Mexico State. I did my PhD there, and the discoverer of Pluto, Clyde Tombaugh,
Yeah.
actually, he was the founder of our department, and he died when I was there, I think in 98 or 99, something around that time, maybe 99. And there was a, later on, there was a Pluto Horizon mission, the New
Right.
Horizon
New
mission that
Horizons.
went,
Yeah.
and he took and that mission actually took his some of his remains in there, and it was interesting because the head of that mission, he didn't say much while he came to visit New Mexico, and or at
Is
the
this Alan
university.
Stern?
Yeah, he
Yeah.
didn't say that officially, so I cannot say what he said
Oh,
officially, but there was this concern. I should say that in general there was a concern because the mission was about to go, and they usually they seal everything, it's like vacuum sealed, and they are getting ready for everything, and then the question was, okay, so the remains can go, and they were very worried, like, about, okay, all the electronics and everything is all done, and to add something to it, that actually adds a lot more
hmm.
work to that. So can I so this is something that is happening now, and we are going to talk about the status of moon as sacred, and in this particular case, for example, the claim of sacredness comes from the Navajo nation, and then there is a back and forth with NASA and with Celestis.
Right.
But in some sense, the issue of human remains is more than that, because once you human settlements are expected, there is a plan for the US led Artemis program, Chinese led alliance as well in the next couple of years.
Right.
And there are going to be, it's not about ashes, but eventually, I mean, A, the humans are going to be there, and then more likely than not, there are going to be human bodies or human remains
Right.
on the moon. Does this conversation shed a light on how to think about that and what to do about that?
I don't have a clear answer because there's so many voices and there's not a clear agreement going through. So I think, for instance, there's another anthropologist who does space stuff, Lisa Masseri. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she wrote a book a few years ago called Placing Outer Space. And she
Okay.
talked about the sort of transition from understanding celestial bodies as things to understanding them as places where you can go. So if you see the moon as a place you can go and a place where people can live, then you would have to have some way of disposing of the dead because every culture that's ever existed on this planet has had to deal with that issue. And there's a huge range of understandings about whether, the earth is sacred and the body is polluting, or the body is sacred and the earth is polluting, whether you want there to be cremation as in the Eastern religions where that's more common, or the Abrahamic religions where until recently burial was much more common because there's an expectation of, the judgment day and people being able to rise from the grave. So you want there to be people there. And if the moon is a place where people live, a lot of decisions about how to treat the dead come from religions. And this means that people living on the moon, if people lived out their lifetimes, would have to be able to figure out what to do with dead bodies. And there are a number of different possibilities, right? So I think lunar burial would be probably not what folks would mostly do. I think cremation would be likely, or something similar to burial at sea, where you would just, some places would be very difficult to launch a body into space. Other places, like the moon, with the gravity being only 1/6, it might be a lot easier to do something like that, but I could also see a lot of drawbacks. I haven't really thought about this one. So I
Yeah.
suspect that there would at least be some expectation if cremation was the way to go. A lot of people like to keep their cremated remains of loved ones with them. And would you be denying people that if that were the case for settlements there? On the other hand, if it's more like an outpost, like, I'd have to look at this, but like what goes on in Antarctica, if somebody dies there, my guess would be that remains would be sent back to their families wherever they were. So I think it really depends on what these settlements look like. Are these people living, dying, raising families, or are these people who will go back to Earth anyway? And the questions would have to do with, are we polluting something, or is this just like a new place to live? Certainly when human beings have been exploring, leaving a major continent and say the Polynesians going off to other islands, there wasn't an expectation that you couldn't bury the dead in the new place that you went to. We're going to have to work it out, and I don't think this has been thought about very much.
But to me, this seems like, and these issues of challenges, societal and ethical issues regarding human settlements, are pretty serious, as
Hmm.
because there are a lot of interlocking things that come in, and I'm just perplexed by the fact that it's expected to happen in the next couple of years, and
Right.
some of these foundation issues. So as you mentioned, I mean one of the reasons why burials cannot happen on the moon is because the body otherwise will just stay as is. I mean, there is no way
Right.
of decomposing.
Exactly.
So so otherwise you will just have, like, a bunch of bodies just collecting over
Which
there,
happens in the Arctic, actually.
and then what happens, then what follows from it, so,
Right.
and what does that do in terms of sacredness and things like that? And cremation in certain religious, Abrahamic religious
Mhm.
context, I mean, that is a really like, so I come from Pakistan, so like, from that perspective, it's a really a no for most people.
Right.
And space burial is an interesting one. I mean, I think I do agree, like, but then, yeah, I mean, that to me, I mean, frankly speaking, even if I go, that would be a really cool way to go. Uh, but uh, but these are foundational questions, because we will have to deal with that to a certain degree relatively quickly.
Hmm.
And uh, and contingency has to be, even if whatever plan is, whatever kind of colony. I mean, I think that was an interesting point that you made, that whether they would send dead bodies back or not, but then that adds a significant amount to the expense, because it's these weight that goes in, comes back, and that's a pretty sizable impact on the thing. And especially if there are private companies doing it, they will be looking at their checkbooks regarding
Bottom
that.
line, yeah.
Bottom line, so it's a really fascinating problem. But if I can piggyback on that, and this is something that you wrote about it, like, even on the broader sense, this is a very practical issue of burials, but even on the broader sense about something being sacred, moon being sacred, and you wrote about, but who decides that, and for
Right.
whom? And you, if I can quote you, you said that if I say the moon is made of cheese, you can prove me wrong. If I say the moon is sacred, well, there is no scientific way to, like, dispute that,
Right.
right? And so how is that going to, in your mind, how is that going to get resolved? Is it going to basically precedents that get set, that, hey, Astrobotics or Intuitive Machines or NASA, they are going there, and and then we go from there? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think this is kind of where we are perched. And like, I looked at the trailer for Chai on the Moon, and you're talking about this. It's sort of like we're in this area right now where maybe we are setting precedent. And so it's really hard to know. If I could say, well, ideally, it would involve very thoughtful communication with different people around the world. It would be compiling of information. It would be being respectful as possible under the circumstances. But what seems to me, from a more hard realist perspective, is that the decisions are going to be made by the first people who end up having settlements on the moon. And those people are likely to be the ones that have the resources and the money to send stuff up. And so, once again, it turns into a situation where those who have the strength and the power are going to set what happens in the future, even if the decisions are being made are not the ones that are perhaps the fairest or the most ethical or the most thoughtful. Um, I know a lot of people who have hopes that going into space would be sort of a utopian situation where we could sort of start over. And I would like that a lot personally. But looking at sort of how things are unfolding, we're in a situation now where, unless that were to become a priority very quickly, I don't think that's going to be the way it happens.
Well, we'll come towards the end. I'm going to ask you about sort of like the hopeful and the non-hopeful views of the future. So I will come back to it. But let me pivot. So again, going back on another thing that you wrote, and because that's directly connected to that. So you have, I love the title of your article. It's called "Sherpas on the Moon." And this is in a book, edited volume, Reclaiming Space, which is excellent, which is about progressive and multicultural vision of space exploration, which you are talking about. But like, the question is, that ought to be the case, but we don't know. Likelihood is a little bit less in terms of whether it's going, something like that is happen or not. So can you tell us a little bit, because in Sherpas on the Moon, there is an aspect of other voices that you
Hmm.
want to bring into the conversation about space exploration? And to a certain degree, we are having this conversation regards to that, like, that, okay, so there are power structures that are there. Of course, there is NASA, or there is Artemis Alliance, there is Chinese Alliance, and so on and so forth. But we are trying to have a conversation about what should be the case, because
Right.
outer space or the moon is not the domain of the few. But in some sense, for the moon, how do we bring in other voices that may not have power to bring that? So how do you think about that? And in your article, you give different examples of how this has happened here on Earth versus what might happen on the
Right.
moon.
Yeah, this is something that I was thinking about for a couple reasons. One of which was they've changed the name, but there used to be something called the oh, now I'm going to blank on it, so I'll just move forward. But anyway, I was at a conference a couple years ago and got to talk to a few people involved in sort of thinking through space and ethics and things like that. And we were talking about who should populate Mars. And I was making a strong argument that as many types of people that you can get, the better it's going to be, because it's sort of like you want not just genetic diversity, but also cultural diversity, because the more things you can draw on, the more ways that you can respond to unknowns. And so Sherpas on the Moon, I have to point out that the title comes from an article in The Onion from several years ago, supposed to be about a Sherpa that took the Apollo 11 astronauts to the moon. And it was definitely following the whole sort of traditional way that Sherpas would take people, white, Europeans to, or New Zealanders to Mount Everest, but not ever get the credit for it and do all the hard work. But and the article was meant to be very funny because, of course, the Onion is satirical. Um, but the concept of it, that you've got people who are really great at climbing mountains, who have a long cultural history of climbing mountains. Why are they not being used? That sounds awful. I don't mean used in a bad way, but why aren't their skills being used in, like, people planning Mars missions and lunar missions, where you were going to have mountains, and it might be really important to be able to understand those mountains? And the idea that our skills are transferable, and the idea that certain personalities that can deal with danger and overcome adversity in different ways exists all over the planet. So limiting who goes into space to a very small number of people who are often very much like each other is meaning that a lot of the skills and understandings and perspectives and ways of thinking about the moon or about Mars or other bodies are not being part of the conversation. I'm in the Explorers Club. I'm actually the chapter chair for the Chicago Great Lakes one. And so that particular article, I was really focused less on religion and more on what I hoped for in exploration. And the Explorers Club has got something called Explorers 50, where they're trying to bring in people every year who might not be recognized in traditional ways, but that who are doing amazing exploration. And so they're trying to remedy that to a certain extent. And that was sort of part of my inspiration. It's a really short article. Everything in that book is like 3,000 words. So it's just kind of a taste. But I do feel very strongly that there are, sometimes you have to play, like try to get the economic argument across, which is the more diversity you have, the more solutions that you're going to be able to come up with. And I think the astronomical understandings of different cultures can tell us a lot. The experiences, even things like people living in high altitudes who might not need as much oxygen as people living at sea level, that's something to take into consideration. So I was arguing in that article for NASA and other bodies like NASA, around the world, to JAXA, ESA, to take this into account. And I know that there are people in all of these space agencies who are seeking diversity and who are making those initiatives. But at the same time, I'm aware in the surrounding space culture that sometimes, like with everything else, efforts to promote diversity hit a backlash where people feel like I'm the best one for the job and I'm being excluded. But that at the cost of diversity. So it's a really complicated issue, but I feel very strongly that there are good economic and scientific reasons for seeking cultural and ethnic diversity in astronaut populations or space settler populations.
Yeah, and I'll ask you one other question regarding that. But before that, by any chance, did you have a chance to read Seven Eves by Neil Stephenson?
No, but I have a colleague I work with who's been recommending that to me. So I just had a conversation about Seven Eves last week.
Okay, so I'm not going to give you too much spoiler, but in some sense, I have to parse my words carefully. But let's put it this way: that there is a very explicit way of, in the book at least, to think about the diversity from genetic perspective and cultural perspective as well. It's more like from an engineering perspective, but anyway,
Okay.
I don't want to give too much away. But yeah, but there is an element to it. I'm not sure I 100% agree with that philosophy, but nevertheless there is that
Okay.
element in there. I mean, he's a very
I know it's
thoughtful
Neil
person.
Stevenson, so I've got a little sense of what it's going to, yeah.
Very thoughtful. I mean, like, he will think about it. So yeah. So in that sense, if I can push you a little bit more in terms of, again, with the voices, uh and again, I mean, I'm thinking more in terms of most of the world, most of the world's population, the representatives of most of the world's population are not being represented
Right.
by the people going to the moon. And do you think there is a way right now, because this is happening soon, of bringing those voices in a more serious way into those conversations, into those decision making stuff? Not just the UN, because UN, yeah, you can have those things, but I mean, that doesn't make any dent in it. But do you think there is a way where people can organize, there is a way where people can bring those concerns? Do you think there is a way of bringing those other voices into decision making about ethical issues or societal issues on the moon?
I think there could be. I think people within those, companies, agencies could make an effort to do that if they were to be made more aware of the benefits of it. I think that there can be more of a push for it that could come from, grassroots organizations. I know, for instance, there are a lot of organizations, like I'm working with something called Cosmic Girls right now that are trying to get more girls and women interested in space. So there are organizations like that are kind of like almost interest groups that are seeking to interact with space agencies, both private and governmental agencies, to try to increase that. And I think that kind of thing should be encouraged. I think too, there's the matter of representation, where when you don't have images of people like you doing things in space, it's sometimes very hard to imagine that. So I appreciate very much the, certain amount of diversity in the Artemis 2 crew, for instance. I always like to joke around. I mean, they got a Canadian in there. That's pretty diverse. But but the chance to have somebody who's black on the moon and a woman on the moon, and I know that NASA's doing a lot to sort of try that, but I think there's also a tendency to look only at your own population, so
Right.
to draw from citizens of your country. And I think trying to do there are models for international cooperation, right? The International Space Station is a fantastic example of that. I think some of the efforts for different countries to work together to become like a larger voice. So, for instance, there are efforts by African countries to kind of come together, kind of model after the European Union, where if there are small countries, but they can work as a unit that gives them a larger voice and a chance to be sort of at the table. There are activities going on around the world where different groups, I mean, I was in Brazil last summer. There's certainly everybody's working on space programs. And I think that there needs to be a spirit of cooperation for it to happen. I'm optimistic that there can be a spirit of cooperation. I think we need to sort of go beyond just our traditional allies and look into communities and see them not as underdeveloped or, not up to the technological par of where we are. I mean, when I think about this is kind of a tangent, but I remember hearing, oh, people in the southern half of the earth, they just don't have phones the way we do. The technology is so limited. But then when cell phones became a thing, it was like there's this huge technological like leapfrog that happened where you just move forward and suddenly, yeah, everybody's online and everybody's using WhatsApp. And, it's like these kinds of leap forwards, we have examples of them. So I think if countries can work with each other, can band together, can create like a unified voice, and then demand a seat at the table, I think that might be a really good way to go. It's just hard because you're trying to get, like European Union is like adding people and losing people, and it's not always a steady state, but
But even there, I mean, I think what you are referring to is more about participation, right?
Mhm.
It will still uh, the issue of, say, for example, if there are concerns like some indigenous groups have about the use of the moon, like other groups have, if they say, well, the moon should be used in a particular way, and this would come in terms of mining on the moon as well, which come in. I mean, there are scientific reasons why you may want to protect the moon. So, for example, astronomically, there may be telescopes, and people are trying to protect. Well, there may be sites in there that you should not mess with, or you should
Right.
protect it, and so on and so forth. But I'm thinking in terms of, like, that the voices that have traditionally been marginalized here on Earth. I mean, to me, it seems like those voices probably are going to still be marginalized on the moon, and that, in some sense, like the Outer Space Treaty, which is a much more optimistic treaty, which is
Mhm.
actually a relatively good thing that humans did in the 1960s. We seem to be backsliding from there rather
Yeah.
than, here is the moon, so let's think about how we can really think in terms of humanity,
Right.
in terms of the framework, like, that, okay, so what are the values that different people bring, and of course not everybody has to agree with that, but how do we incorporate more people in? So I think that's the type of framework that I was
Mm.
thinking about.
Yeah, I can see that. And like, you know, I was trying to sort of present an idealist approach. Um, but at the same time, I think when you're talking about the steamroller of capitalism, really,
Right.
the idea that, okay, on the one hand, I can make a bunch of money. And on the other hand, if I take this group's views into account and they don't want me to do the thing that I'm going to do to make a lot of money, it's very unusual for a company to say, you know what, we're just not going to do it. Instead, they're going to say, well, if we don't do it, somebody else is, so we might as well do it. And maybe we'll try to be more thoughtful than they would have been. But I feel like they're going to be, no matter what happens, no matter what happens with the moon, it's going to violate somebody's
Right.
understanding of what the moon is and what the moon should be used for. And even if we leave it completely alone, it's going to violate somebody's understanding of what we should be using the moon for. This is you know, the truth of living in an incredibly complex planet with so many different cultural groups whose values and understandings and beliefs and desires are so varied. I mean, you were talking about Seven Eves. I'm thinking about Star Trek. I keep thinking, okay, so how did they get from here to there? How do we do it?
But
You know,
Gene Roddenberry, I
Mhm.
think, I love the philosophy of Star Trek. I mean, right? I mean, like that actually foundationally took um, an optimistic view of humanity, and the '60s version did bring in. I mean, there was a Russian on the
Oh yeah,
spacecraft. There was an African American woman on board, and then it had issues. Sort of like colonial intervention type of issues, and so
right,
next generation they try to solve that. I think because the roots were, and again I know this is fiction and I get excited about that, but I mean because the roots were okay, because the roots were trying to fix these things in a humanistic way. And so yes, there were interventionist problems, but then they fixed that in next generation. When post-colonial critique came along, they go like, oh yeah, maybe Captain Kirk should not have been doing certain things that he was
right.
doing, and so Captain Picard didn't. So that's an interesting thing in there. Uh, so can I ask you on a slightly different question,
Sure.
and it is a little bit linked, but let me ask you that question. And you have written about in a different paper, you wrote about the overview effect,
Hmm.
and the overview effect, for
Frank
people who
White's,
don't
yeah,
know, that is the idea, like, that what happens, how people get astronauts who have looked at, who had seen the earth from far away from the earth, and they're looking back on the planet, it is the overview effect, and it impacts them. And you write a little bit about, sort of like, that it can bring awe, and people have written about it, but it can also bring fear. And talking about William Shatner also went
yeah,
on uh, the Amazon, the Jeff Bezos's Blue
right.
Origins
Blue
flight, and he
Origin,
came
yeah.
back, and then he wrote, like, that he was actually really fearful, and so on and so forth. What do you think about that? I mean, I'm very skeptical about it, but like, that, so when people say, okay, well, overview effect, it transforms people people's views about humanity and about themselves, and so on and so forth. Do you think that is something that happens? Do you think that is a hopeful way, in some sense, of thinking about it?
I think so. There's a lot to unpack there. So, like, the overview effect is Frank White's idea that started with him in an airplane looking down on the ground and seeing that he could see where cars were traveling, and you have like a much clearer view of what's happening. And then he noticed that astronauts up in space can always just look at the Earth and kind of see storms and see, different things that are happening on the planet. And it makes it very clear from the astronauts I've talked to um, that not everybody experiences this. So I had one astronaut who was very much, oh yeah, I got ready. I went to the cupola. I was going to go out. I meditated a little bit. And then I looked out, and yeah, I mean, it was fine. There wasn't anything that I saw that I wasn't expecting. Yeah, there are no borders. I knew that already. He was just very, yeah. On the other hand, I have talked to astronauts for whom, like, it really, really shifted them. Like, especially the more evangelical Christian type astronauts I've spoken to, it was very much like seeing the Earth from God's perspective, or seeing things in biblical verses like the Psalms that are laid before him, or the Book of Job, where they can see things that they connect to, scripture, and in ways that were very moving to them. So there's a variety of ways. Now, looking at the Earth, the whole fear thing, The people I've talked to have mostly, if they feel fear, it's more anxiety that we can destroy this. This is fragile. Now I can see from out here just how thin the atmosphere is. One of the astronauts I interviewed was like, "Yeah, I think we're going to destroy ourselves in 500, 1,000 years, something like that." Like he came away with a very pessimistic view from looking at the Earth from space, which is not the perspective that you hear about a lot. But I think for a lot of people, it really it takes something that's abstract and makes it extremely concrete. So you step back and you're like, yeah, this is a planet. So whatever that does to somebody, that's important. The other thing that I've found in my research is much rarer is what I've been calling the ultraview effect. And I'm actually got a book I'm working on about this right now, which is when astronauts, it's very hard to do, get dark adapted and are in a situation where they can look not at the Earth, but out into space, into the Milky Way. And apparently, under those circumstances, the amount of stars you see is beyond imagining, beyond anything you can see on Earth. There's no space between them. It was described to me as a solid wall, just no light between. I mean, no space between the stars at all. And that was once again taking something that was abstract and making it feel very real, where instead of like, now I can see it and I understand it, it's more like I'm going to quote one of my astronauts. Sorry, there's a little salty word in here, but he said, "We don't know crap about anything. We really don't." And I have to feel that anything that can reduce an astronaut to feeling like he doesn't know anything is kind of good. And so the book that I'm working on right now is really focused on this idea that humility might be a product of coming into contact with a reality beyond our planet, that we pretend we know what's going on, but we really don't. And once you make the decision to accept that you don't know what's going on, then you can open your mind to new information and you can seek out the truth, or try to at least seek explanations. I think so many people in the space industry and elsewhere kind of operate on the level like, yeah, we know what's going on. This is we've got it. We know how this works. We know how that works. When the reality is, we know we know a little bit about our planet. We don't know about the oceans. We don't know what's in the oceans. 95% of it hasn't really been examined. And when we get off the planet, we really know very little. We can send cameras out to look at stuff, and that's pretty cool. But we there's so much we can't even comprehend how much we don't know. And so I'm hopeful that if we can take more moments to try to recognize what we don't know, that it will slow us down a little bit and make us more cautious and make us more thoughtful and make us more inclined to seek out cooperation and get more voices involved to try to understand what's happening. I mean, some of the stuff that I've read about the Seven Sisters constellation, where there are ancient accounts where there was a seventh one, and these ancient accounts from all around the world have stories where the seventh one disappears and we can't see it anymore, but ancient people could. And just understanding time that way and how much accumulated knowledge is in places that aren't NASA, you know, there's so much else that we could be bringing into this if we did recognize our own ignorance. And I don't mean ignorance in a bad way, but our own limited knowledge. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to make the argument about in this book that's coming up probably next year.
Oh, that's great. I'm looking forward to it. This is really fascinating. I mean, in some sense, so I got into astronomy because of Carl Sagan, and of course, one of the things that he popularized was the pale blue dot,
Right.
right? And so and that is and that's the perspective it gives, right? I mean, like, that, okay, well, you are here, you are a pixel. And then more recently it was the Cassini spacecraft also took a picture where the Earth is
Yeah.
a blue dot next to the majestic rings of Saturn.
Right.
Uh, and and so this is what uh, I guess this is where my question comes in, is like, that as humans, and this is where about experience, so you're a perfect person to ask about that as an anthropologist as well. I mean, like, so the difference between thinking in an abstract manner, and in terms of sort of like describing it, so what Sagan wrote, I mean, his words, and in some sense a lot of the beauty and a lot of the things we get transformed by is poetry, for example, like,
Hmm.
and Sagan's prose was poetic and you get moved by it. And in some sense, that concept of pale blue dot is a really beautiful way of describing this overview effect without actually being in space, right? um, and and so I'm just curious, as an anthropologist, I mean, like, that do you think there is a foundational difference in terms of this experience that you have when you go out in space and look down at us,
Hmm.
versus this kind of an abstract poetic expressions that you get? Because in terms of an influence, right, because not everybody can go in space, I'm just
Right.
trying to think about, like, the way it comes in is like, okay, so can we, how can we make a change, right? And like, and of course, looking at the Earth from some of the Apollo missions when they were coming back, I think it's the Apollo 17 one, there was the image of the
Um,
Earth.
with
And that,
Africa.
like,
Yeah.
people talk about sort of like, that gave birth to the environmental movement to a
Right.
certain degree, although there was something before that too, but that certainly go like, oh well, wait a minute,
Like the
here is
whole
the
Earth
Earth.
catalog, and understanding the Earth as a planet. I think that was really something that shifted. I grew up with a TV show called The Big Blue Marble that started, the world's a big blue marble when you see it from out there. Like that was the sort of opening song. And no, I think we can do some kind of transformation. It's interesting. I don't know if you know Christopher Kokinos. He's a
No.
poet. He's got a new book coming out about the moon, and he's got a book about meteorites. He's interested in culture and history. He was at writing, did writing and stuff at the University of Arizona. But he's doing an analog mission coming up in what used to be Biosphere 2, and it's all going to be artists and poets and a choreographer. And it's going to be interesting to see the perspective that artists take. And he and I were talking very recently about perhaps we do need to have people who have a more humanist bent, a more cultural bent, a more artistic vision. Because if they're the ones going into space, he said, you talk to, you look at these astronaut memoirs and they're like, well, I'm not a poet, I'm an engineer. Like they can't describe it. But maybe if we do have people who can describe it, or maybe if you make it part of astronaut training to be able to convey what you're experiencing. Um, Maybe that would be a way of sharing that perspective with the rest of the planet. I think most of us see ourselves as a single planet now. It's obviously there are some outliers, but the idea that we're one planet hasn't necessarily led to, and we all have one voice and we all must work together. And I think we need to figure out ways to get to that may or may not come from space exploration, but it's certainly something that has the potential to
Right.
lead us in that direction, I think.
I guess that was the roundabout way. That's exactly right. Like, that, okay. I mean, how does that shift happens? Because even after seeing all of that stuff, our divisions stay the same and everything remains the same. And that's my worry, is like, and so, and once we go to the moon or other places, that shift is not going to happen, but rather we will still be focused on these divisive issues. We're close to the end, and I have one other question, directly related to something that you study. I mean, that's about the pilgrimages and shrines and things like that.
Mhm.
I'm just curious, what do you think will happen to the Apollo landing sites, in
I wondered if
particular
you were
to
going to ask me about that.
Apollo 11? Yeah.
Um, yeah, no, I think there's strong movement. There are space archaeologists out there. I'm thinking specifically of Alice Gorman. I don't know if you know her, but she's very interested in kind of she's worried about space pollution and having too much junk out there, but she also is wanting to make sure that heritage sites on the moon are preserved, right? So that becomes something interesting. And I'm trying to remember Andy Weir's novel after The Martian. Was it Athena? I'm
I think
trying to
so. I
remember the
didn't read
name
that
of
one.
it,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it took place on the moon and is. But one of the things that there were tourist sites where you could go visit the Apollo 11 landing, and people would go out in their spacesuits, kind of go out and stand around and stare at it. And I remember reading that, thinking, yeah, I can kind of see that. I think there's interest in protecting those sites. I think it would be very heartening to have images taken of those sites and see what's there and see, the the footprint still there. I mean, obviously the flag, which was a little questionable anyway, but that's all bleached out, right? So anything that's going to
Right.
be in the sunlight is not going to be looking the same. But some of the stuff will still be there. And I think there was such a sense of unity at the first, human landing on the moon, where all the different countries were kind of working together, not working together, but paying attention. There were greetings from countries around the world, and people felt like it was an accomplishment for the entire planet. And those moments of what we anthropologists of religion call, following Victor and Edith Turner, communitas, this sense that the divisions disappear and everybody is united and seeing things the same way. It tends to be temporary, but it's associated with pilgrimage. Victor and Edith Turner would go to pilgrimage sites and talk about how there was this strong unity of purpose, unity of understanding. Um, you see that at Mecca, you see that at Lourdes. I mean, if you start looking, there's divisions and there's differences, but there's still this kind of shared experience that connects people to each other. And I think it's hard to capture that more than once. It'll be interesting to see whether the first Artemis landing has the same impact as the first Apollo landing. But even the second Apollo landing and third Apollo landing, it dissipated. So I'm a little worried about that. But I do think that to create that common unity, if there's a recognition of something that we as a species have to do together or have to protect ourselves. There are all these movies about, the giant meteor that's coming to hit the earth and everybody bands together, or the aliens land. I'm hoping there are ways that are more positive, like the Apollo landing, that can create that connection and keep it going. I'd love to see good I'd love to see. This is like a challenge. I don't know if anybody would do this, but some of the companies interested in gaining capital from mining asteroids or going on the moon or whatever, if they could take the lead and bring in more voices and create a stronger sense of unity as they go forward, it could make a tremendous difference for the planet. I think there just has to be the will to do it.
Do you think, and this is, I'm just throwing a wild one at you, like, I mean, I was just curious, like, that do you think that the Apollo 11 site, for example, become a religious shrine? I mean, I know it's a secular shrine to a certain degree, sure, but do you think in 100 years or 200 years or something like that, I mean, because of a symbolism that is attached to that, can it be sort of like, that people really think of it as a sacred place, genuinely sacred, not as a secular, but
Religions transform over time.
right.
So it's possible that a new religious movement could come in that would take it as a sacred place. Um, I think if it got distant enough where people realized that something had happened there, but they lost the narrative. And this happens in a lot of sacred places where there's like a story, an association. I'm thinking about, populations that are like, we all descended from one person and this was our hero that came and started our community. That kind of thing I can imagine coming into play. um, Slightly differently, it is the site of a religious ritual, right? So one of the first things that happened on the moon was Buzz Aldrin took communion, Christian communion, and he had communion wine from his church in Webster, and then also communion wafer. And he didn't have his mic on, but he read a little prayer and he took communion there. So I'm not saying it would become a Christian religious site, but there's definitely at least a history of a Christian ritual on the moon. Um, I don't know that I wouldn't put money on it becoming a religious site,
Right.
but I think a lot of sites that are not religious still can maintain that sort of sacred quality. So I think about there's a variety of them, everything from in the United States, Gettysburg, which is this tremendous battle site, and people take it very seriously, to Graceland, where Elvis Presley lived. You know, Depending on the person, it becomes like the being there is so important. Right now, I think it being the first place where humans set foot on the moon is not big enough to overshadow being on the moon. So, for instance, somebody who landed on the moon, they'd probably be more blown away by being on the moon than they would by seeing this site. But maybe someday, if we have a population that's sort of long lasting on the moon, maybe it would become like a really, really important place, an important site. Um, it would just have to be under the right circumstances.
Last thing, um, how do you see the future in terms of are you hopeful in terms of uh, the way space exploration is going? Are you worried? And I know both things can be there too, but overall, what is your bigger instinct in terms of that? Well, I mean, yes, there are issues, but we are on the right track, or well, I mean, we are on the wrong track, but there are good issues. How do you see that? How do you see it unfolding?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Um, my husband, Glenn, always gives me trouble for being a Pollyanna. So I tend to see things in a more positive way. I tend to always kind of notice the more positive outcomes that are possible. So it's hard to predict the future, obviously. I think there's a lot of benefit to humankind that could happen going into space. I think space is going to be transformative once we really get it going. Right now, we're just taking little baby steps. We've got our toe in the end of the pool. We're not really doing anything yet. Some of the stuff I find most fascinating is going to space medicine conferences and hearing doctors and surgeons and geneticists and people talk about the body's response to things like radiation, the body's response to microgravity. These things are very, very dangerous to our bodies. But then I hear astronauts talking about genetic editing and using CRISPR to do things. And I know John Bialeski is another anthropologist who's been working on transhumanism as a religious movement. And so if I had to guess, and I'm thinking very long term in the future, it would end up being one of these situations where this is going to sound kind of out there, but humanity does something like create a new version of ourselves that can withstand radiation, that can gestate in microgravity, because we don't know if that's possible, that can, thrive under these conditions, and that the us who's out in space is not necessarily the us who's on Earth right now. But there's so much we have to learn before we can get to that point. So, in the short term, do I think we're going to have people living on Mars in 2050? No, I don't think we are. Are we going to start to learn things that will allow us to do stuff in 200 years, 500 years? I'm more optimistic than my astronaut who thought we were going to destroy ourselves. I think we're going to figure stuff out, but I think we have to be patient, and I think we have to be thoughtful and go slow. And just my opinion. I'm not prognosticating, but I do think that we're not ready quite yet, but we're starting to get ready to get ready.
I think we need poets to be going in, and I think that will teach us patience. By the way, something that you mentioned reminded me that Stephen Hawking, in his book Universe in a Nutshell, and Stephen Hawking had cameos on Star Trek, The Next Generation as well. He loved Star Trek.
Right.
And one of the things that he wrote was, so Star Trek, The Next Generation is based in 24th century. And he said that the most unbelievable thing about the Star Trek series are not the aliens, but the humans, because
Right.
humans look like humans. It's like, there is no way that in the 24th century we are going to look like who we are, but we would have modified because of genetic engineering and other types of things and stuff like that. I think that's and that's to a certain degree, that's what you were also saying, how things are going to modify.
Yeah, Stephen Hawking and I are just like this, the way we think. I'm just kidding.
Well,
no, I had not come across that, but I agree with him, and it's sort of a feeling I'm getting from being, learning about this culture and what seems to make sense to people. So I think we will get there, but I think we just need more time, and I think we have hopefully time to do that.
Great. Well, Professor Weibel, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, very wide-ranging, and I hope to have a conversation again with you about the Pope's astronomer at some point.
Yes, the Vatican Observatory was really fun to go to and spend time with those fellows. They just blow me away with the stuff they understand. So thank you, Professor Hamid, for inviting me and including me on your program. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.